Have you ever been the only car on a highway so empty, you started to wonder if something made everyone else disappear? I was driving through the Nevada desert at 3 a.m. when I realized the truck that had been following me for the last 40 miles was matching my exact speed, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see the driver's face. And when I finally worked up the courage to pull over and let it pass, it pulled over too. Welcome to Verified Fears. Have you ever been the only car on a highway so empty, you started to wonder if something made everyone else disappear? I was driving through the Nevada desert at 3 a.m. when I realized the truck that had been following me for the last 40 miles was matching my exact speed, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see the driver's face. And when I finally worked up the courage to pull over and let it pass, it pulled over too. I'd taken Highway 50 across Nevada because my GPS suggested it would save me 2 hours on my way to Sacramento. What it didn't mention was that those 2 hours would be shaved off by driving through what felt like the surface of another planet. Endless stretches of desert where the only light came from my headlights and a moon so bright it cast shadows across the cracked asphalt. The radio had died about an hour back, somewhere between the last gas station and whatever came next. My phone showed no signal. Just me, the road, and the darkness pressing against my windows like something alive. I first noticed the truck around 2:15 a.m. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, maybe half a mile back, and at first I was relieved. There was someone else out here. I wasn't completely alone in this vast emptiness. But as the miles rolled by, something started to feel wrong. The truck never got closer, never fell back. It maintained the exact same distance behind me, like it was tethered to my car by an invisible rope. When I slowed down to 60, it slowed down. When I sped up to 75, those headlights stayed at that precise distance, unwavering and constant. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe the driver had cruise control set at the same speed. Maybe they were just as tired as I was, zoning out and not really paying attention to how closely they were following. But there was something about those headlights that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. They were too high off the ground, suggesting a large commercial truck. But the spacing between them seemed wrong. Too wide, or maybe too narrow. I couldn't quite tell in the darkness. Every time I tried to focus on them in my mirror, they seemed to blur slightly, like looking at something through water. The highway stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line, disappearing into a horizon I couldn't see. No curves, no hills. Just flat, endless desert on both sides, with the occasional skeleton of a dead tree or weather-beaten sign warning of flash floods. The landscape felt wrong at this hour, too still and too quiet, like a photograph of a place rather than an actual place. I started to feel like I was driving through a diorama, some artificial recreation of Nevada rather than Nevada itself. At 2:47 a.m., I passed a mile marker, number 168. I watched my odometer click forward, counting the distance. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. At 2:53, I passed another mile marker, number 168, the same number. I blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd misread the first one. Maybe it was 167 or 169. But I knew what I'd seen. The same mile marker, 6 minutes and at least 4 miles apart. The truck behind me maintained its distance, those strange headlights burning into my rearview mirror like eyes that never blinked. I started talking to myself, just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. It's fine. You're tired. You've been driving for 9 hours. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. The truck is just another driver. The mile markers are different, and you're not paying close enough attention. My voice sounded small and unconvincing in the car's interior, swallowed immediately by the darkness outside. I turned on the dome light just to feel less alone, but the reflection in my windshield showed my face looking pale and drawn, eyes too wide, and behind me, through the rear window, those headlights still burning at that exact same distance. The next town, according to my GPS, was supposed to be 30 miles ahead, a place called Austin with a population of 192. There would be gas, maybe a 24-hour diner, people, witnesses, safety. I pushed the accelerator down, watching my speedometer climb to 80, then 85. The desert blurred past. The headlights behind me stayed exactly where they'd been, neither gaining nor falling back, as if my increased speed meant nothing at all. As if distance was just a suggestion out here and the normal rules didn't apply. That's when I started to feel it. A creeping certainty that something was deeply wrong, not just with the truck or the mile markers, but with everything. The road itself felt wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, without the usual bumps and patches that characterize even well-maintained highways. The painted lines were too bright, almost glowing in my headlights. And the darkness beyond my windows had taken on a quality I can only describe as thick, as if the night had substance and weight. I had the irrational thought that if I opened my door, the darkness would pour in like water and fill the car until I drowned in it. I decided to pull over. If the truck was just another driver, they'd pass me and I could calm down and realize how ridiculous I was being. If they didn't pass, if something else happened, then at least I'd know I wasn't losing my mind. I eased off the gas and pulled onto what passed for a shoulder. Just a strip of dirt and scattered rocks barely wider than my car. I put the car in park, but kept the engine running. My headlights cut into the darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but more empty road. In my rearview mirror, the truck's headlights slowed as well, then stopped, exactly the same distance away. My heart hammered against my ribs. The truck sat there, engine presumably running, headlights on, not moving, not passing. Just sitting there on the highway behind me as if waiting, watching. I counted to 60, giving them time to realize I'd stopped and go around me. They didn't move. The air inside my car suddenly felt too thin, like I was at a high altitude, even though the elevation sign miles back had read only 5,000 feet. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles went white. Then the headlights turned off. Complete darkness behind me. No taillights, no running lights, nothing. The truck had simply vanished into the blackness. I stared at my rearview mirror, trying to see any shape or shadow that would indicate the vehicle was still there. But the darkness was absolute. The moon that had been so bright earlier seemed to have disappeared as well, or maybe clouds had covered it. I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of my own headlights. For a wild moment, I considered getting out of the car and walking back to where the truck had been, just to prove to myself it was real. But everything in my body screamed against that idea. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes. No other cars passed. No lights appeared in either direction. Just me and my car in the middle of nowhere with my engine running and something wrong with the world. Finally, I put the car back in drive and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating quickly, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had been following me. My headlights swept across the road ahead, and for just a second, I thought I saw something standing on the shoulder about 50 yards ahead. A figure, tall and wrong somehow, with proportions that didn't make sense. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I convinced myself it had been a road sign or a bush or just a shadow cast by my own headlights. I drove for another 30 minutes at 90 miles per hour, checking my mirror obsessively. Nothing followed me. The road remained empty. When I finally saw the lights of Austin appearing like a miracle on the horizon, I nearly cried with relief. The town was exactly where it should be. Real and solid and full of ordinary things like street lights and closed shops and a gas station with fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes. I pulled in and sat in the parking lot with my engine off, hands shaking, breathing hard. A clerk was visible through the window, restocking cigarettes behind the counter. Normal? Real? Safe? I never saw the truck again. When I got back on the highway an hour later after coffee and a bathroom break and a chance to convince myself I'd been hallucinating from exhaustion, the road was just a road. The mile markers progressed normally. Other cars appeared eventually as dawn began to break. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong out there in the deepest part of the night. Something about the distance between myself and those headlights. The way they matched my every move perfectly. The way they simply disappeared when I stopped. And the figure I might have seen standing by the road. I made it to Sacramento by noon. I've driven that highway twice since then, always during daylight, and it looks completely ordinary. Just a long stretch of empty desert road that connects one place to another. But I've never driven it at night again. Because sometimes when I'm lying in bed in the dark, just before I fall asleep, I think about those headlights maintaining that perfect distance. Never closer, never farther. Just there, watching, following, waiting for something I still don't understand. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my car and walked back through the darkness toward them. I wonder what I would have found. Or what would have found me. What would you do if someone in your group started responding to voices that nobody else could hear? I've been guiding rafting trips down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon for 8 years. And in that time, I've seen dehydration, altitude sickness, panic attacks, and every kind of fear the canyon can produce in people. But I've never seen anything like what happened to Marcus Chen during the July trip of 2023. And I still don't have an explanation that makes sense. The trip was a standard 4-day commercial run from Lee's Ferry to Phantom Ranch, about 88 miles of river with some of the most spectacular rapids in North America. We had 14 passengers, 2 rafts, and perfect weather. Clear skies, temperatures pushing into the high 90s during the day, cool enough at night for comfortable sleeping. Marcus was traveling alone, a software engineer from Seattle taking a solo vacation after what he described as a brutal divorce. Quiet guy, mid-40s, seemed experienced enough with outdoor activities. Nothing about him raised any red flags during our safety briefing at Lee's Ferry. The first day went perfectly. We ran Badger Creek Rapid and Soap Creek Rapid without incident, stopped for lunch at the Navajo Bridge Overlook, and made camp around mile 30 near the mouth of Ryder Canyon. Marcus was engaged and friendly during dinner, asking good questions about the geology, taking photos of the canyon walls glowing red in the sunset. He seemed fine, happy even, like the river was doing what it's supposed to do, washing away whatever stress he'd brought with him from the outside world. The second day, we pushed through some bigger water. House Rock Rapid at mile 17 gave everyone a good soaking. And by the time we stopped for lunch at mile 36, the group was bonding the way groups do when they've survived something exciting together. That's when I first noticed Marcus acting differently. He was sitting apart from the others, staring at the river with an intensity that seemed off. When I asked if he was okay, he looked at me with a strange expression and said, "Do you hear that?" I listened. Just the normal sound of the Colorado, that constant rush and gurgle of water moving over rocks. I told him I heard the river. He shook his head. No, under it. Something under it. I chalked it up to river ear. Sometimes people who aren't used to the constant white noise of rapids start hearing patterns in it, like when you listen to a fan running and start to hear music or voices. The brain trying to make sense of meaningless sound. I told him it was normal and to make sure he was staying hydrated. He nodded, but didn't stop staring at the water. The way his head tilted slightly to the left, like a dog hearing a high-pitched frequency. It made something uncomfortable twist in my stomach. That afternoon, we ran President Harding Rapid and several smaller drops, and Marcus seemed to snap out of whatever mood had taken him. He was laughing with the other passengers, getting splashed in the bow and enjoying it. I started to relax. Maybe it had just been the heat or dehydration despite my warnings, or just the overwhelming nature of the canyon affecting someone sensitive to it. The Grand Canyon does that sometimes. It's so vast and ancient and indifferent to human presence that some people have trouble processing it. They get quiet and withdrawn, confronted with their own insignificance. We made camp at mile 52 near Nankoweap Creek. The campsite sits on a broad sandy beach with cottonwood trees providing shade and a view of the canyon walls that makes you feel like you're at the bottom of the world. Which, in a sense, you are. By the time we'd unloaded the rafts and set up the kitchen, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping into something more comfortable. I was helping passengers set up their tents when one of my co-guides, Sarah, came over looking concerned. "Marcus is standing in the river," she said. "Just standing there. Won't respond when I call to him." I found him about 30 yards downstream from camp, standing waist-deep in the Colorado River with his arms hanging at his sides. The current was strong enough that he had to lean forward slightly to keep his balance. His eyes were closed. I called his name twice before he seemed to hear me. When he opened his eyes and looked at me, there was something absent in his expression, like he'd been somewhere else entirely and had to travel a long distance to get back. "They want me to come deeper," he said. His voice was calm, matter of fact. That scared me more than if he'd been panicking. I waded into the river and grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward shore. "Who wants you to come deeper?" I asked. He looked at me like I was stupid. "The ones who drowned," he said. I got him back to camp and sat him down near the fire with a water bottle and some food. Sarah and I exchanged looks. This was beyond normal altitude sickness or dehydration. Marcus ate mechanically, not really tasting the food, his eyes constantly drifting toward the river. The other passengers had noticed something was wrong and were giving him space, their conversations quieter and more subdued. I made the decision that if he wasn't better by morning, we'd activate our emergency protocol and call for an evacuation at Phantom Ranch, which was only a day's rafting away. The canyon has a phone there. Medical help could reach him. That night, I woke up to the sound of splashing. My watch said 2:17 a.m. I grabbed my headlamp and got out of my tent to find Marcus standing at the river's edge, fully clothed, water lapping at his feet. He was talking to the river in a low, conversational tone, like he was responding to someone speaking to him. I got close enough to hear what he was saying. "I know. I understand. Yes, I can hear you better now. Yes, I'm coming." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed his shoulder, and he spun around so fast he almost knocked me over, his face twisted in anger. "They need me?" he said. "They've been down there so long, and they need someone who can hear them." His pupils were huge despite the brightness of my headlamp shining in his face. I got Sarah up, and we took turns watching Marcus for the rest of the night. He sat by his tent, rocking slightly, humming something that might have been a tune, or might have been him mimicking the sound of the river. When dawn broke and the canyon filled with that peculiar orange light that makes everything look unreal, Marcus seemed calmer, more present. He apologized for his behavior, said he hadn't been sleeping well, and the heat had gotten to him more than he'd realized. He sounded rational, almost like himself again. But his eyes kept drifting to the water, and I noticed his lips moving silently, like he was having a conversation he didn't want us to hear. Day 3. We broke camp early, planning to make Phantom Ranch by mid-afternoon. I kept Marcus on my raft where I could watch him, positioning him in the middle, away from the edges. We ran through several big rapids, Quagunt, 60 Mile, and then the intense technical challenge of Hans Rapid at mile 76. Hans has a drop of 30 feet and requires precise navigation, or you'll flip. Every passenger was holding on, focused on survival, adrenaline overriding everything else, except Marcus. In the middle of the rapid, with water exploding over the bow and the raft dropping through holes that felt like falling off a building, I saw him lean over the side and reach down toward the water, deliberately, purposefully, like he was trying to touch something only he could see beneath the surface. I screamed at him to hold on, but my voice was lost in the roar of the rapid. Another passenger grabbed the back of Marcus's life jacket and hauled him away from the edge just as we dropped through the biggest hole. We made it through Hans upright, but barely. When we pulled into the calmer water below the rapid, I was shaking with anger and fear. "What the hell were you doing?" I shouted at Marcus. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through me to something beyond. "They showed me their faces," he said quietly. "There are so many of them down there. More than you'd think. The river never gives them back." I knew then that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. This wasn't dehydration or heat exhaustion or any normal explanation. This was something else. We made it to Phantom Ranch 2 hours later, and I immediately got Marcus on the emergency phone, arranging for a Park Service helicopter evacuation. He needed psychiatric evaluation, possible sedation, definitely removal from the river before he drowned himself or got someone else killed. While we waited for the helicopter, he sat on the boat beach near where Bright Angel Creek meets the Colorado River, his feet in the water, talking to something none of us could hear. The helicopter arrived 45 minutes later. Marcus went without resistance, almost relieved, like part of him knew he needed help. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared over the canyon rim, Sarah asked me what I thought had happened to him. I didn't have an answer. Still don't. Heat-induced psychosis? Some kind of breakdown triggered by his divorce and amplified by the isolation of the canyon? Or had he actually been hearing something real? Something the rest of us couldn't perceive because we weren't listening the right way. I looked into it afterward. Called the hospital where they'd taken him. But patient confidentiality prevented them from telling me anything except that he'd been treated and released. I tried to find drowning statistics for the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, curious about his claim that there were bodies down there the river never gave back. Turns out, over the last century, hundreds of people have drowned in these waters. Not all the bodies are recovered. The current is too strong, the canyon too deep, the water too cold and fast. Some people go in and simply disappear, taken by the river and never returned. I've run that stretch of river maybe 50 times since then. Every time we pass Nankoweap Creek or camp at Phantom Ranch, I think about Marcus standing in the water with his eyes closed, listening to something I couldn't hear. And sometimes, when I'm standing watch at night while the passengers sleep and the river moves past in the darkness, I'll catch myself tilting my head slightly to the left, trying to hear beneath the surface noise, trying to understand what called to him so insistently that he nearly answered. I never hear anything except the river. But there are moments, just before I fall asleep in my tent with the sound of the Colorado a few feet away, when I'm not entirely sure that's true. How would you react if you woke up and your entire campsite had been moved while you slept? I'm talking about everything: tents, gear, food containers, sleeping bags with people still in them. Relocated 200 yards away from where you set up camp, with no footprints, no drag marks, no explanation. That's what happened to me and 3 friends at Horseshoe Mesa in the Grand Canyon during our spring break trip in March 2024. And I still can't find a rational explanation for it. We were all seniors at Arizona State, looking for one last adventure before graduation scattered us across the country. Jake, Meredith, Chen, and me. We'd gotten backcountry permits for 3 nights at Horseshoe Mesa, which sits like a platform jutting into the canyon about halfway down the Grandview Trail. The permit system is competitive, but we'd applied early and gotten lucky with Site BF5, one of the designated camping areas near the old mining ruins. The forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, daytime temperatures in the low 70s, nights dropping to the 40s. Cold enough to need a good sleeping bag, but nothing extreme. The hike down on day 1 was brutal. 3 miles of steep switchbacks dropping through layers of ancient rock, each turn revealing more of the canyon's impossible vastness. We reached Horseshoe Mesa around 3 p.m., legs burning, thoroughly exhausted but excited. The campsite was exactly where the map indicated. A flat area about 50 yards from the main trail junction, marked by a rock cairn and a designated tent pad area. Mining ruins from the 1890s, scattered around the mesa, gave everything an eerie, abandoned feel, but in a cool, historical way. Rusted metal, collapsed structures, the mouth of the Last Chance mine like a dark eye staring out of the rock face. We set up our 2 tents in the designated spots, established a kitchen area about 20 feet away, where we hung our food bags from a metal pole the Park Service had installed, and laid out our sleeping pads and bags. Everything by the book. We'd all taken wilderness safety courses, knew about proper food storage, understood the importance of following leave no trace principles. By the time we had camp established, the sun was getting low and the temperature was dropping fast. We cooked dinner, watched the canyon walls turn orange and purple in the sunset, told stories, laughed too loud in the vast silence. Normal camping stuff? Perfect. Around 10 p.m. we killed our headlamps and went to sleep. Jake and Chen in one tent, Meredith and me in the other. The last thing I remember was listening to the wind moving through the canyon, that low, mournful sound it makes when it pushes through narrow gaps in the rock. I fell asleep feeling satisfied and tired, in that good way you only get after a hard day of physical activity. I woke up wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Wrong light, wrong sound, wrong feeling. My watch said 6:47 a.m. The sun was already up, but the angle of light coming through the tent fabric seemed off, too bright on the wrong side. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled out of the tent, expecting to see our campsite with the kitchen area and Jake and Chen's tent nearby. Instead, I was looking at completely unfamiliar terrain. Different rocks, different bushes. The mining ruins that should have been visible to the north were now southeast. The entire perspective was wrong. Meredith crawled out behind me. "Where are we?" she asked. Her voice was small and confused, like a child who'd gotten lost. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I could see Jake and Chen's tent about 15 feet away, same relative position to ours as last night. But everything else was different. Our kitchen area was exactly where we'd set it up relative to the tents. 20 feet away, same direction. But it was all in a completely new location. I walked to the edge of what I now realized was a different shelf of the mesa, looking down into a drainage I didn't recognize. Behind us, maybe 200 yards away across scrubby terrain we definitely hadn't crossed, was the area where we'd originally made camp. I could see the rock cairn, the tent pad areas empty and undisturbed. Jake emerged from his tent, looking pale. "What the fuck?" he said. Chen was right behind him, already checking his GPS. "This doesn't make sense," Chen said, staring at his device. "According to this, we're at these coordinates." He showed us the screen. But we camped at these coordinates. The two sets of numbers were close, but definitely different. About 200 yards different. "Did we sleepwalk?" Meredith asked. "All four of us? And carried our tents and all our gear?" I walked around our new campsite, looking for evidence of how we'd gotten here. No footprints, except the ones we were making now. No drag marks from the tents. No disturbed vegetation suggesting heavy objects had been moved across the ground. The rocky soil should have shown something, but it looked completely undisturbed, except for the immediate area where our tents now sat. The thing that really scared me was how perfectly everything had been relocated. Our tents were the exact same distance apart. The kitchen area was in the exact same position relative to the tents. Our food bags still hung from a metal pole that definitely hadn't been here when we'd gone to sleep, because we'd hung them from the designated pole at the other site. But when I hiked back to the original campsite, that pole was still there. Empty. So there were two poles. Had there always been two poles? My memory felt slippery suddenly, uncertain. Had we really camped where I thought we'd camped? Chen suggested we'd been drugged, maybe some gas or chemical that knocked us out and made us disoriented. But that didn't explain the physical impossibility of moving everything so precisely. 4 people, 2 tents, all our backpacks, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, food bags, water containers. We're talking hundreds of pounds of gear, relocated without waking any of us or leaving a single mark on the ground. And who would do that? Why? We hadn't seen another person since starting down the Grandview Trail yesterday. The backcountry permit system meant we knew exactly who else was supposed to be in the area, and the nearest other camping party was miles away at Cottonwood Creek. Jake wanted to hike back up to the rim and report it to rangers. Chen wanted to stay and investigate, take photos, document everything. Meredith just wanted to understand what had happened. I felt a growing dread that had nothing to do with rational explanation and everything to do with the primal fear of being in a place where the rules don't work right. We compromised by staying at the new site, since that's where all our gear was anyway, and spending the day trying to figure it out. We hiked back to the original campsite multiple times, measuring the distance, looking for any evidence of disturbance. Nothing. The GPS confirmed we were now 217 yards northeast of where we'd camped. The terrain between the two sites was rough, scattered rocks, low bushes, uneven ground. Not impossible to cross, but it would take time and effort. And moving all our gear across it would be loud and obvious. We took photos of everything: the undisturbed ground, the 2 different campsites, the positioning of landmarks. Chen even made a video walking between the 2 sites, narrating the impossibility of what had happened. That night, none of us wanted to sleep. We sat around our stove. We decided not to make a campfire because somehow that felt dangerous, like attracting attention, and tried to rationalize what had happened. Mass hallucination, carbon monoxide from our stove, except we'd cooked outside in open air. Shared delusion? But the GPS coordinates were objective reality. The photos proved we'd been in one place and we're now in another. Chen suggested we were still at the original site and only thought we'd moved, some kind of perceptual shift caused by dehydration or altitude. But we could literally see the original site from where we sat, empty and distinct, 2 football fields away. Around 2 a.m., Meredith fell asleep despite herself. Then Jake. Chen and I stayed up watching, both of us too scared to admit we were scared. The canyon at night is profoundly dark, the kind of darkness that feels old and heavy. Stars overhead so bright they cast shadows. And that wind again, moving through the rock, sounding almost like breathing. "If it happens again," Chen whispered, "we'll know we're not crazy." I didn't want it to happen again. The thought of waking up in another location, moved while unconscious, arranged like dolls by something we couldn't see or understand, made my skin crawl. When dawn broke and we were still in the same spot where we'd stayed awake, I felt relief and disappointment simultaneously. Relief that we hadn't been moved again. Disappointment that we had no new evidence, no answers. We'd all just endured a night of fear, guarding against something that didn't happen. But the original relocation remained unexplained and impossible. We broke camp after breakfast and hiked out that morning, a day early, none of us willing to spend another night on that mesa. The hike up Grandview Trail was exhausting, 3 miles of steep climbing. But I pushed hard, desperate to get back to the rim, back to the normal world where things stayed where you put them. At the ranger station, we tried to file a report. The ranger, a woman in her 50s, who'd probably heard every weird story possible, listened politely and wrote down notes. When we finished, she asked if we'd been drinking. We hadn't. She asked if anyone had taken drugs. We hadn't. She suggested maybe we'd gotten disoriented and actually set up camp in the second location and only thought we'd been in the first spot. The permit system showed no one else had been in that zone those nights. No explanation for 2 metal poles. No explanation for anything. I've researched since then, looking for similar stories, other accounts of impossible relocations, anything that might help me understand. I found stories about missing time, about hikers who lose hours they can't account for. Stories about people who wake up miles from where they fell asleep with no memory of moving. But nothing quite like what happened to us. Nothing about entire campsites being perfectly relocated while people slept inside them. The 4 of us don't talk about it much now. Jake graduated and moved to Seattle. Chen's in grad school in Boston. Meredith and I stayed in Phoenix, but when we meet for coffee, we avoid the subject. It's easier to pretend it was some weird shared hallucination, some trick of exhausted minds and high altitude and the overwhelming strangeness of sleeping in a place so remote and ancient. But I still have the photos, the GPS coordinates, the undeniable evidence that we went to sleep in one place and woke up in another, moved by something we never saw, never heard, and will never understand. And sometimes late at night, I think about what would have happened if we'd woken up a 3rd time in an even more remote location. Or what would have happened if we hadn't woken up at all. What would you do if your camera kept capturing something your eyes couldn't see? I've been a professional landscape photographer for 12 years, specializing in national parks and natural wonders. And I've shot Mather Point at the Grand Canyon maybe 40 times. I know that overlook like I know my own living room. Every angle, every light condition, every composition. But in December 2023, during a pre-dawn shoot for a coffee table book I was working on, my camera started recording something that wasn't there. Or maybe something that was always there, just invisible to human eyes. I still don't know which possibility terrifies me more. I'd arrived at Mather Point around 4:30 a.m., earlier than necessary, but I wanted to set up without competing for space with the sunrise crowd that inevitably shows up. The South Rim in December is brutally cold before dawn. Temperatures hovering around 15 degrees with wind that cuts through every layer you're wearing. But the light makes it worth it. That progression from complete darkness to the first hint of blue in the eastern sky, to the moment when the sun breaks the horizon and sets the canyon walls on fire. That's what I'm there to capture. That's what pays my bills. I set up my Canon R5 with a 24-70mm lens on a sturdy tripod about 50 yards east of the main Mather Point overlook, away from the railings and the inevitable tourists. I was shooting an intervalometer time-lapse, one photo every 5 seconds for 2 hours, to capture the entire sunrise sequence from complete darkness through the golden hour. Standard technique for this kind of work. I'd done it hundreds of times at dozens of locations. The camera does its job automatically while I drink coffee and enjoy being alive in a beautiful place. Simple, professional, routine. The sky was clear, stars brilliant against the blackness, no moon. Perfect conditions. I triggered the intervalometer at 4:47 a.m. and settled in with my thermos, watching the canyon emerge gradually from darkness as my eyes adjusted. The void below filled with layered shadows, hints of the vast architecture hidden in the dark. This is the part I love. Being present at the transition, watching the world wake up. I wasn't looking at my camera screen. No need. I trusted my settings, trusted my equipment, trusted my experience. The sunrise was spectacular. Deep oranges and reds painting the upper canyon walls while the depths remained in purple shadow. A few other photographers showed up around 6 a.m., set up their tripods, took their shots. Polite nods exchanged, but no conversation. We all knew we were there for the same thing, and talking would ruin it. By 7 a.m. the show was over, and I packed up, downloaded the 1,140 raw files to my laptop at my hotel in Tusayan, backed them up to a portable drive, and went to get breakfast. Standard workflow. Everything normal. I started processing the sequence that evening in my hotel room, importing the files into Lightroom and scrubbing. Through the thumbnails to check exposure and composition. That's when I first saw it. Frame 347, time-stamped at 5:18 a.m., showed a dark silhouette standing at the very edge of the rim, about 200 yards west of my position, right at the unfenced area where the rock drops straight down into the canyon. The figure was completely black against the pre-dawn sky, no detail visible, just a human-shaped shadow. I didn't remember seeing anyone standing there. But it was dark. I'd been focused on my coffee and the horizon. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. People do dumb things at overlooks, standing too close to edges for dramatic photos. Not my problem. I continued scrubbing through the sequence. Frame 348, 5 seconds later. The silhouette was still there, same position. Frame 349, still there. I started clicking through frames individually now, watching the figure frame by frame. It remained perfectly motionless for 30 frames. 2.5 minutes of absolute stillness at the edge of a cliff in 15-degree weather before sunrise. That was weird, but not impossible. Maybe they were meditating or getting a very long exposure photo. Frame 377, the figure was gone. Just empty rim, empty sky, the canyon beyond. I went back to frame 347 and zoomed in on the silhouette. The shape was wrong. The proportions didn't quite match a normal human. Too tall maybe, or the head too large. Something about the arms or the way it stood. But the image was dark and the figure was in silhouette, so detail was hard to distinguish. I applied exposure adjustments to try to bring out more information, but the figure remained completely black. No recoverable shadow detail at all. Like it was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. That bothered me more than it should have. Even in silhouette against a bright sky, you can usually recover some detail from raw files. This was just solid black, pixelated when I zoomed too far in, but with no texture or variation. I continued through the sequence. Frame 523, time-stamped at 6:03 a.m., the figure was back. Different location this time, east of the overlook, closer to where I'd been standing, maybe 100 yards away. Full daylight now, sunrise already happened, golden light flooding the canyon. And I definitely would have seen someone that close to me. I was completely alone at that point, I'm certain of it. The other photographers hadn't arrived yet. But there in my photo, clear as anything, was a silhouetted figure standing at the rim, in full daylight. Still completely black with no detail, just a human-shaped void. My hand started shaking slightly as I clicked through the next frames. The figure remained stationary for 12 frames, 1 minute. Then in frame 5:36, it had moved. Not walked, not shifted position gradually between frames. Just appeared 10 feet closer to the edge in a single 5-second interval, as if it had teleported. Frame by frame, it continued this stuttering movement toward the rim, each jump covering impossible distances, until in frame 5:49 it was right at the edge, leaning forward at an angle that should have been impossible to maintain without falling. Then it started falling, but wrong. A person falling off a cliff drops fast, accelerates, disappears in maybe 2 or 3 frames at 5-second intervals. This figure fell in slow motion across 27 frames. 2 minutes and 15 seconds of continuous, gradual descent into the canyon. Each frame showed it slightly lower, arms spreading slightly, body tipping forward in incremental degrees, like watching someone fall through thick syrup or underwater. Completely impossible physics. Frame 576, the figure was gone, presumably far enough below the rim that the camera couldn't see it anymore. I sat staring at my laptop screen in my hotel room with my hands pressed against my mouth, breathing hard through my nose. This wasn't possible. People don't appear in photos when they're not there. Cameras don't capture things that don't exist. I checked the metadata. No evidence of tampering, original files straight from the camera's memory card, no corruption indicated. I examined frames before and after the figure appeared. Normal exposure, normal contrast, no artifacts or anomalies. Just this thing that shouldn't be there. I went through the entire 1,440 frame sequence systematically, documenting every appearance. The figure showed up 7 separate times across the 2-hour shoot, always at the rim, always in silhouette, always completely black regardless of lighting conditions. Sometimes stationary, sometimes moving in that stuttering teleportation style, and twice more going through that slow-motion falling sequence. The final appearance was in frame 1391, time-stamped at 6:43 a.m., full daylight, sun well above the horizon. The figure stood at the exact spot where I'd had my tripod set up, as if it was standing where I'd been standing, looking at where I was now in the past. That realization made my skin crawl. I spent the next 3 days researching. Lens flares don't look like human silhouettes. Sensor artifacts don't move position frame by frame. Infrared pollution doesn't create solid black shapes. I posted anonymously on photography forums asking about unexplained shapes in time-lapse sequences, got some responses about dust on the sensor or birds caught mid-flight or light reflections. None of it matched what I was seeing. I contacted Canon's technical support asking about potential sensor issues that might create human-shaped anomalies. They had no explanation, but offered to inspect my camera if I sent it in. I shot another time-lapse sequence at Mather Point a week later. Same location, same setup, same time of day. Different memory card, different lens. just to eliminate variables. The figure appeared in 32 frames of that sequence. Always at the rim, always falling in slow motion, always that same wrong silhouette that didn't quite match human proportions. I watched my surroundings obsessively during that second shoot, looking for anything that might cast a shadow or create an obstruction that my camera would register. Nothing. I was completely alone. The rim was empty. But my camera disagreed. I researched Mather Point's history. Suicides happen at the Grand Canyon. About 12 deaths per year at the park, some of them intentional jumps. Mather Point specifically has seen several fatalities over the decades. People get too close to the edge, lose their balance, or deliberately step off into the void. The Park Service doesn't publicize exact numbers or locations for obvious reasons. But the information exists if you dig. I found references to at least 6 confirmed deaths at or near Mather Point since the 1950s. Falls, mostly ruled accidental. Bodies recovered from the canyon floor hundreds of feet below the rim. I haven't shot at Mather Point since that second attempt. The camera is fine. I've used it at dozens of other locations without any anomalies appearing in my images. Just normal landscapes, normal light, normal physics. But I kept those files, encrypted them, stored them in 3 separate locations because some irrational part of me is afraid they'll disappear or I'll be accused of faking them. They're evidence of something I don't understand and can't explain and definitely can't include in any professional portfolio without destroying my credibility. Sometimes I go through the sequence frame by frame late at night, studying that silhouette, trying to understand what I captured. The slow-motion fall haunts me particularly. The way the figure tips forward degree by degree, arms spreading like wings, taking minutes to do what should take seconds. Like it's trapped in the moment of falling, repeating it endlessly, caught between the rim and the canyon floor in some temporal loop. My camera can accidentally record, but my eyes can never see. I've talked to other photographers who shoot the Grand Canyon regularly, carefully bringing up the subject of unexplained anomalies in time-lapse sequences, without showing them my images. Most think it's technical issues or user error. One guy got quiet and said he'd seen something similar at Yavapai Point, but wouldn't elaborate. Another mentioned that long-exposure nighttime shots sometimes capture streaks near the rim that don't correspond to anything visible. Not stars, not planes, not light pollution. Just movement where there shouldn't be movement. The scientific part of my brain knows there has to be a rational explanation. Camera malfunction, sensor issue, some optical phenomenon I don't understand. Maybe even deliberate hoaxing by someone tampering with my equipment while I wasn't looking. Though that seems far-fetched. But the part of me that stood at Mather Point in the cold darkness before dawn, completely alone on that ancient rim, looking down into a void that has existed for millions of years and claimed dozens of human lives. That part wonders if cameras see more than we do. If they can record wavelengths or dimensions or moments that exist outside our perceptual range. If something about the Grand Canyon's specific combination of depth and age and death has created echoes that only show up in photographs taken with the right equipment at the right time. I'm writing this from Moab, where I'm shooting Arches National Park for a different project. Safe subjects, no cliffs, no history of falling deaths. But my camera sits on the hotel dresser, and sometimes I look at it and wonder what it's seeing right now that I can't. What invisible figures are standing in this room, falling in slow motion through floors and walls, trapped in moments that my eyes will never perceive, but my camera might accidentally record if I just pointed it in the right direction and waited. Have you ever found something in a place where nothing should exist? I've been working maintenance at Grand Canyon National Park for 6 months now, mostly doing basic repairs at the historic buildings along the South Rim. Before this, I spent 15 years in construction in Phoenix, so I know buildings, their bones, their systems, their secrets. But in February 2025, I found something beneath El Tovar Hotel that shouldn't be there. And I still can't explain what it means or who's responsible, or whether I should have reported it to someone other than my supervisor, who told me to forget about it and never go back down there. El Tovar is the crown jewel of Grand Canyon lodges. Built in 1905, all dark wood and stone and rustic elegance perched right on the canyon rim. It's a beautiful building, but old, which means constant maintenance issues. Pipes freeze, electrical systems need updating. The foundation settles unevenly because it's built on the edge of a geological marvel that's still slowly eroding. Normal old building problems. I'd been assigned to investigate a persistent water leak in the basement storage area near the north wing, something that had been dripping for weeks and creating mold concerns. The basement of El Tovar isn't particularly creepy during the day. Just a typical old hotel basement with stone walls, low ceilings, exposed pipes, and that perpetual smell of damp and age. The leak was coming from somewhere in the far corner behind stacked boxes of linens and old furniture. I moved everything aside, found the wet spot on the wall, and started examining the stone foundation to locate the source. That's when I noticed the mortar between two large foundation stones looked wrong. Too clean, too new. Like it had been recently repointed while everything around it was original 1905 construction. I pressed on the stone and it moved slightly. Not much, just a millimeter or two. But foundation stones don't move. I got a crowbar from my tool bag and carefully worked it into the seam, applying gentle pressure. The stone shifted more easily than it should have, and when I pulled harder, it came free entirely, revealing a gap behind it. Not a crack or a settling issue, a deliberate opening. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the darkness beyond the stone. A tunnel. Hand-carved from bedrock, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, extending back into the earth beneath the hotel. This wasn't on any building plans I'd seen. I'd studied the El Tovar schematics when I started working here because I like to know the layout of buildings I'm responsible for maintaining. There was no mention of tunnels or subterranean passages, just the basement level, foundation, and the natural bedrock beneath. I should have called my supervisor right then. Should have reported it, documented it. Let someone else make the decision about what to do. But I've been in construction long enough to know that old buildings hide things. Forgotten utility passages, old coal chutes, Prohibition-era smuggling routes. This was probably just some abandoned maintenance access from the original construction. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled in. The tunnel was tight, forcing me to crouch uncomfortably, but it was clearly man-made with tool marks visible in the stone walls. The air smelled stale and mineral-heavy, like cave smell, but with an underlying scent I couldn't identify. Something organic. After about 30 feet, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, maybe 8 feet square and just tall enough for me to stand. And that's where things stopped making sense. There was a camping chair in the chamber. Modern, collapsible, the kind you buy at REI. Next to it was a LED lantern, currently off but definitely recent manufacture. A sleeping bag was rolled up against one wall. 3 bottles of water sat in the corner, labels still bright and readable. A paperback book lay on the stone floor. A thriller by Lee Child, the copyright page showing it was published in 2023. Fresh items. Contemporary items. In a sealed chamber beneath a 120-year-old hotel. My heart started beating harder. Someone had been here recently, was maybe still coming here. But the stone I'd moved to access the tunnel had been mortared in place, and that mortar had been old enough to fool me initially. How were they getting in and out? I swept my flashlight around the chamber more carefully, looking for another exit. On the far wall, I found it. Another passage, even narrower than the first, sloping slightly downward and curving away into darkness. I should have left then. Every instinct said this was wrong, potentially dangerous, definitely not something a maintenance worker should be investigating alone. But I was angry suddenly. Someone was using park property illegally, creating a safety hazard, potentially damaging a historic structure. I crawled into the second passage, following it as it wound through the bedrock, getting narrower and more claustrophobic. The smell got stronger, that organic scent, almost like cooking, but not quite. Like food had been prepared recently, but I was smelling the ghost of it. The second chamber was larger, maybe 15 feet across, and it was furnished. That's the only word I can use. Furnished like someone lived there. A foam mattress with blankets and pillows. A plastic storage container filled with canned goods and dried foods. A bucket with a lid that I absolutely did not want to investigate. A stack of books. A battery-powered radio. Clothes hung from hooks driven into the stone walls. And most disturbing, photographs taped to the rock, snapshots of the canyon, of tourists at overlooks, of the interior of El Tovar's lobby. Recent photographs, digital prints. I stood there breathing too hard in that enclosed space, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone was living here, beneath the hotel, in chambers that shouldn't exist, coming and going somehow, without being noticed. The implications cascaded through my mind: security breach, criminal trespass, potential danger to hotel guests. I needed to report this immediately. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight swept across something that made my blood freeze. Scratched into the stone wall above the mattress were dates. Dozens of them, carved directly into the bedrock with something sharp, covering several square feet of wall space. The oldest date I could see was February 14th, 1987. The most recent was 3 days ago. 38 years of dates. Whoever had been using this chamber had been doing so for nearly 4 decades, which was impossible because the entrance I'd used had been sealed with old mortar and no one could live down here for that long. And the dates themselves suggested something far stranger than simple trespassing. I got out of there faster than I'd entered, crawling through the passages in near panic, convinced I'd hear footsteps behind me or feel hands grabbing my ankles. When I emerged back into the El Tovar basement, I immediately moved the foundation stone back into place and stacked boxes in front of it, breathing hard and sweating despite the basement's chill. I found my supervisor 20 minutes later and told him everything. He listened with an expression I couldn't read, then asked me to show him the location. We went back down together. The stone wouldn't move, or I worked at it with a crowbar for 15 minutes while my supervisor watched. But it was solid foundation, mortared in place with mortar that looked 100 years old and showed no signs of recent disturbance. He examined it carefully, running his fingers along the seam, tapping it with his knuckles. "Solid," he said. "This hasn't been moved?" I insisted I'd been through it less than an hour ago. Described the chambers, the camping equipment, the dates on the wall. He looked at me with something like pity and said, "February is hard on people up here. Isolation, altitude, the winter darkness. Maybe you should take a few days off." I haven't gone back to that corner of the basement. My supervisor reassigned me to exterior maintenance work, which I suspect was deliberate. but I've researched El Tovar's history obsessively since then. The hotel has a complicated past, built by the Fred Harvey Company, expanded multiple times, renovated extensively in the 1980s. I found references to coal storage tunnels in the original 1905 construction, but they were supposedly filled in during renovations. I found records of guests who went missing over the decades. Not many, but a few. People who checked in and never checked out, disappeared into the canyon, or just vanished entirely. One name kept appearing in my research: William Crenshaw, a hotel employee who disappeared in February 1987. Just stopped showing up for work. His room was found empty, his belongings gone, no forwarding address. The hotel assumed he'd quit without notice, not uncommon for seasonal workers. But February 14th, 1987 was the first date carved into that chamber wall. I found a photograph of hotel staff from 1986 in the park archives. William Crenshaw is in the back row, thin face, dark hair, looking uncomfortable in front of the camera. I'm 90% certain he's also in one of the modern photographs I saw taped to the chamber wall, standing at Mather Point Overlook, barely visible in the background, but recognizably the same person who should now be in his 60s at least, but looked maybe 35. I submitted a formal written report to park administration describing what I found. It was filed, and I received a brief response thanking me for my diligence and assuring me the matter would be investigated. 3 weeks later, I was told the investigation found no evidence of tunnels or chambers beneath El Tovar. No signs of unauthorized access, no safety concerns. The basement had been thoroughly inspected by a structural engineer who confirmed the foundation was intact and unmodified from its last documented inspection. I still work at Grand Canyon, though I've requested transfer to a different area, and I'm waiting for approval. I avoid El Tovar entirely now. Won't even eat at the restaurant there despite it being the best food on the South Rim. Because sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those dates carved into stone. 38 years of someone marking time beneath a hotel built on the edge of an ancient canyon. And I think about how the oldest buildings in the park sit directly above the canyon rim, built on bedrock that extends down through layers of geological time. And I wonder what other spaces exist in that stone. What other chambers carved by hands we'll never see, occupied by people who found ways to slip between the world we know and spaces we're not supposed to access. The leak in that basement corner stopped, by the way. Fixed itself somehow. The maintenance logs show I completed the work order, though I never actually found or repaired the source. And every few weeks I check the local news and park incident reports, looking for mentions of William Crenshaw or reports of someone living in unauthorized spaces or anything that might validate what I saw. Nothing ever appears. Just the normal rhythm of park operations, tourists visiting, employees working, everything proceeding as if there's nothing beneath our feet except solid stone and geological history, instead of something older and stranger that knows how to hide in the spaces between. Would you stay at your post if you saw something approaching through the darkness of a lightning storm? I'm a seasonal park ranger at Grand Canyon National Park, and in August 2024, I pulled overnight duty at Desert View Watchtower during one of the most violent monsoon storms I've ever experienced. What I saw during those hours has made me request reassignment to any position that doesn't involve being alone at night. And I've started the process of leaving the Park Service entirely because I can't reconcile what happened with any rational explanation, and I'm terrified it might happen again. Desert View Watchtower sits at the eastern edge of the South Rim, a 70-foot stone structure built in 1932 to resemble ancient Puebloan watchtowers. It's a popular tourist spot during the day, offering panoramic views of the canyon and the Colorado River winding through it thousands of feet below. At night, especially during the off-season, It's one of the most isolated duty stations in the park. The nearest building with people in it is the visitor center, a quarter-mile away. When you're up in that tower after dark, you're essentially alone with the canyon and whatever weather decides to roll through. August is monsoon season in Arizona. The storms come fast and violent, building throughout the afternoon and breaking loose in the evening with lightning that turns the canyon into something from another world. Every flash illuminates layers of rock stretching back hundreds of millions of years. And the thunder echoes through the canyon in waves that feel like they're coming from inside the earth itself. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. We keep someone stationed at the tower during storms because tourists sometimes try to shelter there. And we need to make sure the building stays secured and nobody does anything stupid like trying to take lightning photos from the observation deck. I arrived for my shift at 8 p.m. The storm was already building, massive clouds piling up to the east, lightning flickering inside them like strobes. That particular smell in the air that comes before heavy rain. My supervisor, Mariah, briefed me quickly. Standard protocol. Keep the doors locked, monitor the weather radio, make rounds every hour to check for damage or trespassers. Call if anything concerning develops. She left around 8:30, and I watched her truck disappear down the road toward the main rim, tail lights fading into the gathering darkness. Then I was alone. The storm hit hard around 9 p.m. Rain came in sheets, blown sideways by wind that made the tower creak and moan. Lightning struck close, so close I could feel the static electricity raising the hair on my arms, even inside the stone building. Thunder followed immediately. No delay. The sound so loud, it felt physical. I was on the second floor in the small ranger station room, trying to do paperwork by flashlight because the power had gone out within the first 10 minutes of the storm. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. Just weather. The first lightning strike that illuminated the grounds clearly enough for me to see details came around 9:47 p.m. I was looking out the west-facing window, watching the storm move across the canyon, when a brilliant flash turned night into day for maybe half a second. In that flash, I saw the entire area around the tower. The parking lot, the low stone walls, the trail leading to the rim overlook. And I saw a figure standing in the parking lot about 50 yards from the tower, just standing there in the rain, motionless. When the darkness returned, they were gone. I told myself it was a tourist who'd gotten caught in the storm, maybe looking for shelter. But they hadn't approached the tower. They'd just been standing there, and I hadn't seen a vehicle in the parking lot when I'd arrived. I grabbed my radio to call it in, but the storm was creating too much interference. Just static and broken fragments of other rangers' transmissions. I decided to wait for the next lightning flash to see if they were still there. The next clear flash came maybe 30 seconds later. The figure was still in the parking lot, but closer, maybe 30 yards from the tower now. Same motionless posture, standing in the driving rain. They hadn't walked. I would have seen movement between flashes if they'd been walking normally. They'd just appeared closer, like they'd teleported forward in the darkness between lightning strikes. My mouth went dry. This wasn't right. People don't move like that. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio and went down to the first floor, planning to open the door and call out to them, offer shelter, figure out what was going on. But something stopped me with my hand on the door handle. Some instinct that said opening that door would be a mistake. I looked through the narrow window next to the entrance instead, waiting for the next flash. When it came, the figure was at the edge of the parking lot, maybe 15 yards away. Close enough that I should have been able to see details, clothing, face, body shape. But the figure was just a silhouette. completely black despite the brilliant white light of the lightning. No features, no texture, just a human-shaped void standing in the storm. And with this flash, I noticed something that made my legs weak. There were more of them. 3 figures now, spread out in an arc around the tower, all standing motionless, all facing toward me. The darkness between flashes felt heavier now, more oppressive. I backed away from the door, my flashlight beams shaking because my hands were shaking. My radio was still producing nothing but static. The weather radio upstairs was crackling with severe thunderstorm warnings and flash flood alerts, but that didn't help me. I was alone in a stone tower with something outside that wasn't behaving like people should behave, and no way to call for help. Next flash. 5 figures. They'd formed a tighter semicircle, closer to the tower, 10 yards away maybe. Still motionless, still featureless. The lightning revealed them in stark relief against the rain-soaked ground, but they cast no shadows despite the directional light. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with people. People have shadows. People move continuously, not in teleporting jumps. People don't stand in monsoon storms wearing no visible rain gear or clothing. I ran back upstairs to the observation deck level, irrationally thinking that height would provide safety. The windows up there offer 360-degree views of the surrounding area, and I pressed against the glass, watching for the next flash, dreading it and needing it simultaneously. When it came, I counted 9 figures. They'd surrounded the tower completely, standing maybe 8 yards from the base, arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward, all motionless in that impossible way. The storm was reaching its peak intensity. Lightning strikes were coming so frequently now that I could almost maintain continuous vision of the grounds, the darkness between flashes lasting only seconds. And with each flash, the figures were closer. 7 yards, 6 yards, 5 yards. The circle tightening with mechanical precision. I could see now that they weren't quite the right proportions. Too tall, maybe, or the head-to-body ratio slightly off. Or something about the way they stood that suggested joints in wrong places. The lightning made them strobe closer in stuttering frames, like a nightmare flip-book animation. I was hyperventilating, pressed against the inner wall of the observation deck, trying to keep all the windows in my peripheral vision. 4 yards, 3 yards. They were at the base of the tower now, and I had the terrifying thought that they might start climbing. The tower has external architectural features, ledges and decorative stonework and the ladder that maintenance uses, that something determined could potentially use to ascend. I looked up at the ceiling uselessly, as if I could see through it to confirm nothing was on the roof. 2 yards. They were pressed against the tower walls now, and I couldn't see them anymore from the observation deck because they were directly below the windows. But I knew they were there. I could feel them there, surrounding me, perhaps already beginning to climb. The lightning continued its relentless rhythm, and the thunder was constant now, overlapping echoes that made the stone floor vibrate beneath my feet. Then, with shocking suddenness, the storm broke. The rain decreased to a drizzle. The lightning moved off to the west. The thunder became distant, rumbling. The violent phase of the monsoon had passed, leaving behind that strange desert silence that follows storms. I waited 10 minutes before I had the courage to look out the windows again. My flashlight beam swept the grounds around the tower. Empty. No figures. No footprints in the mud. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. I stayed in the tower for the rest of my shift because I was more afraid of going outside than staying inside. But I didn't sleep or sit down or take my eyes off the windows. When Maria arrived at 6 a.m. to relieve me, I was sitting on the observation deck floor with my flashlight dying and my radio clutched in both hands. She took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You're the third ranger to report something like that at Desert View during monsoon storms. The other two requested immediate transfer. One left the Park Service entirely." She told me about a collision in 1956. Two commercial planes that crashed in the canyon during a storm, killing 128 people. The wreckage site is miles from Desert View, but some of the initial search efforts were coordinated from this tower. She told me about older stories, Hopi legends about spirits that walk during lightning storms, beings that exist between the flashes, visible only in that frozen moment when electricity connects earth to sky. She told me the Park Service doesn't officially acknowledge these reports, but unofficially, they try not to assign anyone to overnight tower duty during August monsoons if they can avoid it. I've researched since then, looking for explanations. Ball lightning can create strange visual phenomena. Electromagnetic fields during severe storms can affect brain function, create hallucinations. Isolation and fear can trigger psychological breaks that manifest as perceived threats. I want to believe one of those explanations. I want to believe I hallucinated or misperceived or experienced some rare meteorological phenomenon. But I remember the perfect circle they formed, the mechanical precision of their approach, the way they appeared closer with each lightning flash, maintaining exact spacing, moving in unison like they were parts of a single organism rather than individual entities. I submitted my transfer request the next day. It was approved within a week, which tells me something about how seriously the Park Service takes these incidents despite their official silence. I'm scheduled to move to a ranger station at the North Rim in November, as far from Desert View as possible while staying in the park. But I'm not sure I'll take it, because sometimes at night I close my eyes and I'm back in that tower, watching the lightning illuminate figures that shouldn't exist, counting down the distance as they approach in impossible jumps. And I wonder what would have happened if the storm had lasted longer, if they'd reached the door, if I'd heard them climbing the external walls in the darkness between flashes. The tower still operates. Tourists visit every day, take photos, admire the views, buy souvenirs. Rangers still pull duty there, including during storms. Maybe most people never see what I saw. Maybe you have to be in the right conditions, the right storm intensity, the right time of night, the right frequency of lightning strikes. Or maybe you have to be alone and afraid and paying attention in a way that opens your perception to things that are always there, but usually invisible. I don't know. What I know is that I'll never stand in a high place during a lightning storm again, because I can't stop thinking about what moves in the darkness between flashes, approaching in increments we're not meant to measure, surrounding us in patterns we're not meant to perceive. What would you do if you heard yourself speaking words you hadn't said yet? I've been canyoneering for 11 years, teaching technical rope work and slot canyon navigation through my company in Flagstaff. And I thought I understood how sound works in narrow spaces. Echo behavior, acoustic reflection, the way voices bounce and distort in confined rock formations. All of it familiar territory. But in September 2024, during a solo exploration run through an unnamed slot canyon in the North Rim backcountry, I heard my own voice speaking to me from deeper in the canyon, telling me things that were about to happen before they happened. And I still can't explain it in any way that doesn't make me sound insane. I'd gotten a permit for 3 days of backcountry exploration in a remote section of the North Rim that sees maybe a dozen visitors per year. The slot canyon wasn't on any official maps. I'd found references to it in old geological survey notes from the 1970s and spent 2 years triangulating its location from satellite imagery and elevation data. Technical canyoneering is partly about the physical challenge and partly about being the first person to document something nobody else has found. This canyon looked perfect. Narrow sections requiring chimneying and downclimbing, several rappels, beautiful striped sandstone walls, and absolutely zero human traffic. My kind of place. The approach hike took most of the first day, crossing broken terrain and navigating by GPS because there were no trails. I reached the canyon entrance around 4 p.m. on September 23rd, late in the day to start a technical descent. But I only planned to explore the first 100 yards to assess the route for tomorrow's full descent. The entrance was a narrow crack in the sandstone, maybe 2 feet wide, dropping vertically about 15 feet before opening into the main canyon corridor. I rigged a rappel anchor, checked my gear twice, and descended into the slot. The walls were incredible. Flowing patterns in the sandstone where millions of years of water erosion had carved curves and waves into the rock, colors ranging from deep red to pale orange to almost white. The canyon was narrow enough that I could touch both walls simultaneously with my arms outstretched. And the walls rose maybe 60 feet above me, creating a corridor of stone that blocked most of the sky. Beautiful, pristine, completely silent except for my breathing and the sound of my harness creaking. I moved maybe 50 feet into the canyon, taking photos, assessing the route ahead, planning anchor points for tomorrow's descent. That's when I first heard it. My own voice echoing from deeper in the canyon, saying, I shouldn't have come down here this late. Clear as anything, my exact voice, my speech patterns, even the particular way I pronounced certain words. But I hadn't spoken. I'd been completely silent, just moving and observing. I stopped moving, listened. The canyon was silent again. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, some quirk of the acoustics, or my brain filling in patterns from the ambient sound of wind moving through the slot. I took another step forward and heard my voice again from ahead. Something's wrong with the echo in here. That specific sentence, in my voice. But I still hadn't spoken a single word since entering the canyon. My skin prickled. This wasn't normal. Echoes repeat sounds you've made. They don't generate new sentences. I decided to test it. I spoke out loud for the first time. Hello? The word echoed normally, bouncing off the walls in diminishing repetitions. Hello, 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 low, low. Standard acoustic behavior. Nothing unusual. But then from deeper in the canyon, maybe 30 yards ahead around a curve I couldn't see past, I heard my voice say, I'm going to check around the next bend, even though I shouldn't. That was my thought. The exact thought I'd been having. I'd been considering whether to continue another 30 yards to see what was around the curve, even though the smart decision was to retreat and come back tomorrow with full daylight and proper preparation. But I hadn't spoken that thought out loud. It had been internal. Yet the canyon had spoken it back to me in my own voice. I stood there in the narrow slot, heart beating faster, trying to rationalize this. Sub-vocalization, maybe. Perhaps I'd been speaking without realizing it, moving my lips unconsciously, and the sound had carried. But that didn't explain the timing. The echo was coming from ahead of me, from deeper in the canyon, not bouncing back from behind. And it was speaking sentences I hadn't yet said. Against better judgment, or maybe because the echo had predicted I would, I continued forward. The canyon narrowed further, requiring me to turn sideways to squeeze through sections where the walls were less than 18 inches apart. The light was dimming as the sun got lower, and the slot was in deep shadow now, almost dark. I turned on my headlamp and immediately heard my voice from ahead. "The batteries are dying." I looked at my headlamp. It was bright and steady. But even as I looked, it flickered once, then dimmed noticeably. Within 10 seconds, it had faded to barely functional, batteries draining far faster than they should have been draining. I'd put fresh batteries in that morning. Fear was replacing curiosity now. Something was deeply wrong. The canyon was behaving in ways that violated causality. Effects preceding causes, predictions manifesting as echoes from spaces I hadn't yet reached. I decided to retreat. Immediately. But as I turned around, I heard my voice from behind me now, from the direction I needed to go to exit, saying, "I can't find the rope." I looked up at where I'd descended from. The rope should have been hanging there, visible in my headlamp beam, marking my exit route. It was gone. The anchor was still there, the webbing still wrapped around the rock feature where I'd rigged it. But the rope itself had vanished. Impossible. Ropes don't disappear. They don't pull themselves up through anchors. But it was gone, and I was trapped in a slot canyon in failing light, with a dying headlamp and my own voice speaking to me from the darkness. I tried to stay calm. Technical problem solving. I had prussics in my pack, ascending gear that would let me climb back up if I could reach the anchor. But the anchor was 15 feet straight up through a vertical section with no hand or footholds. Unclimbable without the rope. I had emergency supplies, a backup light source, communication gear. I reached for my radio to call for assistance. My voice echoed from the darkness ahead. "The radio won't work down here." I pressed the transmit button anyway. Dead. Completely non-functional despite having tested it that morning. The canyon seemed darker now despite my eyes adjusting. The walls felt closer, more oppressive. I heard water dripping somewhere, though the forecast had been bone dry and slot canyons don't typically have water in late September. My voice came from ahead again. "I'm going to see if there's another way out deeper in the canyon." That had been my thought. My desperate, irrational thought that maybe if I went forward instead of back, I'd find an alternative exit. But going deeper into an unexplored technical slot canyon in near darkness was suicide. Every piece of my training said to stay put, conserve light, wait for dawn, and climb out in daylight. But the echo had predicted I would go forward. And some terrible part of me wanted to know if the predictions would continue to be accurate. If the echo was actually showing me the future, then following its predictions might be the only way to survive. Or maybe following them was what trapped me here. The causality loop made my head hurt. Was I making decisions freely? Or was I only doing what the echoes predicted I would do because I'd heard the predictions? Could I break the loop by doing the opposite? I decided to test it. The echo had said I would go forward. I would sit down instead. Stay still. Wait for dawn. Break the prediction. I sat down in the narrow canyon, back against one wall, feet braced against the other, and closed my eyes. Listening, waiting to hear what the echo would say about this choice. Silence. Complete silence. For maybe 3 minutes. Nothing but my breathing and my heartbeat and the distant sound of dripping water. Then my voice, from very close behind me, close enough that it felt like someone standing at my shoulder, whispered, "I shouldn't have sat down." I opened my eyes and looked down. Water was flowing past me. Not dripping anymore. Flowing. A stream maybe 2 inches deep, moving fast through the slot canyon, coming from somewhere above. Flash flood. the most dangerous hazard in slot canyons, capable of filling narrow spaces in minutes, drowning people who have no way to climb the vertical walls. But there hadn't been rain. The forecast was clear. Flash floods require upstream precipitation, and I'd checked the weather for a 50-mile radius. This was impossible. But the water was rising. 3 inches now. 4 inches. I stood up fast, water swirling around my boots. My voice echoed from ahead. I'm going to run deeper in. No choice now. The water would fill this narrow section rapidly, and my only chance was to hope the canyon widened ahead or find a chimney I could climb to get above the flood level. I ran, splashing through water that was now 6 inches deep and rising fast, the current strong enough to push against my legs. My headlamp beam was fading, showing less and less of the path ahead. The canyon curved sharply, and I followed it, hearing my voice predicting every choice. I'm going to jump over that rock. I'm going to grab that wall for balance. I'm going to fall. I fell. My boot caught on a submerged rock, and I went down face first into the water, which was now deep enough to cover my head for a moment before I got my hands under me and pushed up, gasping. The current was stronger, much stronger. The water was maybe 18 inches deep, and the canyon was filling like a bathtub. My voice echoed from somewhere. This is how I die. That prediction broke something in me. Pure survival instinct took over. I clawed at the canyon walls, looking for any feature I could use to climb. Found a crack wide enough for my fingers. Pulled myself up, found a foothold, pulled higher. The walls were slick and smooth, but there were just enough irregularities that I could make upward progress, chimneying and stemming and using every technical climbing skill I had. The water rose beneath me, roaring now, filling the slot. I climbed until my arms shook and my fingers bled, and I couldn't climb anymore. Wedged in a narrow section about 30 feet above the flood, watching the water rage past below me. I stayed there all night, wedged in that slot, occasionally adjusting my position to prevent cramping, watching the water slowly recede. My headlamp died completely around midnight. I waited in total darkness, listening to my breathing in the water and occasionally, from somewhere in the canyon, my own voice speaking sentences I couldn't quite make out. When dawnlight finally penetrated the slot, I climbed higher, found a section where the walls were close enough to properly chimney between them, and eventually reached the rim. I hiked back to my vehicle, drove to the ranger station, and reported the flash flood. They were confused. There had been no precipitation anywhere in the area, no upstream storms, no explanation for water in that canyon. A helicopter survey found no evidence of flooding. The slot canyon was bone dry. When I insisted I'd nearly drowned in a flash flood that came from nowhere, they suggested dehydration or altitude sickness might have caused hallucinations. My rope, by the way, was exactly where I'd left it, hanging from the anchor, visible. The ranger showed me photos from the helicopter survey. You could clearly see my rope in the images. I haven't been back to that canyon. I've continued canyoneering in other locations, but I'm hyper-aware now of echoes, of sounds that seem too clear or too precise. And sometimes when I'm in a narrow slot with good acoustics, I'll hear what might be my voice from somewhere ahead, saying something I haven't yet said, predicting what I'm about to do. I immediately retreat when that happens, because I don't know if the echoes show possible futures or force inevitable ones. And I'm terrified of hearing my voice predict something I can't survive. The canyon either showed me my death and I escaped it, or it showed me a false future to test whether I could change it. Either way, there are spaces in the Grand Canyon system where time doesn't flow correctly, where sound carries information it shouldn't have, and where your own voice can become your worst enemy. Could a place remember what happened there so strongly that you'd be forced to experience it? I'm a thru hiker who's completed the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and sections of the Continental Divide Trail. I've spent hundreds of nights alone in backcountry campsites, and I thought I understood wilderness solitude. But in May 2024, I camped at a specific set of coordinates near Clear Creek Trail in the Grand Canyon, where a hiker named Sarah Crenshaw vanished 3 years prior. And throughout that night, I experienced her final hours through sensory flashbacks that grew increasingly violent and terrifying. And I have no explanation for what happened, except that some locations hold onto trauma so intensely that being there forces you to relive it. I'd gotten a difficult-to-obtain permit for a challenging route through the Grand Canyon's backcountry, a 4-day solo trek that would take me through some of the most remote terrain in the park. I'm experienced enough that rangers trust me with permits most people can't handle. I carry proper emergency equipment, I file detailed itineraries, I know my limits. The route included a night at campsite BE4 near Clear Creek, a beautiful area that sees maybe 20 visitors per year. What I didn't know when I applied for the permit was that BE4 was the exact location where Sarah Crenshaw had last been seen alive. I learned about Sarah during my pre-trip research. A 29-year-old botanist from Boulder, she'd been hiking the same route in May 2021, carrying proper gear and following all protocols. She checked in at the ranger station before her trip, filed her itinerary, carried a satellite communicator. On her 3rd night, she activated her emergency beacon from campsite BE4. The message she transmitted was brief. Something wrong. Need help. Search and rescue reached the site within 6 hours. They found her tent, her gear, her backpack with her journal and satellite device still inside. But Sarah was gone. No tracks leading away from camp, no signs of struggle, no blood or evidence of animal attack. Just an empty campsite and a woman who'd vanished into the canyon. The search lasted 2 weeks. Helicopters, dog teams, technical climbers checking every crevice and ledge within a 5-mile radius. Nothing. Sarah Crenshaw had simply disappeared from a campsite in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation. The case remained open, but inactive. Her family still posts appeals for information on social media. I'd read about it while researching the trail, felt sad about it, but didn't think much of it beyond noting it as a tragedy. Disappearances happen in national parks. Sometimes people are never found. I reached BE4 around 4 p.m. on May 18th, exhausted from a brutal day of hiking through broken terrain. The campsite was exactly as described. A flat area maybe 30 yards from Clear Creek, surrounded by scrub vegetation and weathered rock formations, with a view of the canyon walls rising in layers of ancient stone, beautiful and isolated. I could see why the Park Service designated it as a camping zone. I set up my tent in the established spot marked by a rock cairn, filtered water from the creek, cooked dinner, and watched the sunset paint the canyon in shades of orange and purple. Everything normal. Everything perfect. Around 9 p.m., I climbed into my tent and into my sleeping bag. The temperature was dropping fast. May nights in the canyon get cold despite warm days. I was tired enough that I expected to fall asleep immediately. Instead, I lay there feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Not physically uncomfortable. The sleeping pad was fine. My bag was warm enough. I wasn't hungry or thirsty. Just psychologically uncomfortable, like being watched. Like the space around me was occupied by more than just me. I told myself it was normal wilderness paranoia. Being alone in remote places creates hypervigilance. Your brain looks for threats that aren't there. I focused on my breathing, tried to relax, started drifting towards sleep. That's when I smelled it. Coffee. Strong, fresh brewed coffee. Impossible because I hadn't made coffee. I'd only boiled water for a freeze-dried dinner. The smell was so vivid and specific that I opened my eyes, expecting to see my stove still burning somehow. But everything was packed away. No coffee, no source for the smell. Yet I could smell it clearly, that distinctive aroma filling my tent. Then I heard humming. A woman's voice, soft and pleasant, humming a tune I didn't recognize, coming from outside my tent, maybe 10 feet away. I froze, listening. The humming continued for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent, shining the beam around the campsite. Nothing. No one. Just my gear and the empty space and the darkness beyond my light. I called out, "Hello?" No response. Just the sound of the creek and the wind moving through the canyon. I convinced myself I'd been dreaming. That moment between waking and sleeping, where sounds bleed through from imagination into perceived reality. I zipped the tent closed and lay back down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside my tent felt thick and oppressive. My heart was beating too fast. I checked my watch, 9:47 p.m. I tried to sleep again. At 10:15 p.m. I felt cold water on my face, drops of it like someone had flicked wet fingers at me. I sat up fast, wiping my face. My hand came away wet, but my tent was dry. The ceiling showed no signs of condensation or leaking. I touched the wet spots on my sleeping bag, and they were real, definitely water. But there was no source. The sensation of being watched intensified. The space felt crowded suddenly, like my small tent contained more than one person. At 10:33 p.m., I heard breathing. Not my breathing, someone else's. Rapid, panicked breathing like someone hyperventilating. The sound was so close, it seemed to come from inside my sleeping bag with me. I thrashed out of the bag, heart hammering, flashlight sweeping the tent interior. Empty. Just me. But I could still hear the breathing. And as I listened, I realized it was syncing with my own breath. When I breathed in, the phantom breathing breathed in. When I held my breath, it held too. Like I was hearing an echo of my own respiration, but with different emotional quality. Mine was trying to stay calm. The echo was terrified. That's when the first flashback hit. I wasn't in my tent anymore. I was outside, by the creek, in daylight. I could see my hands, and they weren't my hands. Smaller, with different skin tone, wearing a silver ring I didn't own. I was filling a water bottle from Clear Creek, and I felt happy, content, thinking about the botanical samples I'd collected that day. The name Sarah floated through the consciousness I was experiencing, and I realized with absolute horror that I was experiencing Sarah Crenshaw's memories, her thoughts, her perspective. The flashback lasted maybe 5 seconds before I snapped back to my own tent, my own body, gasping and disoriented. But the experience had been completely real. I'd been her. I'd felt what she felt, thought what she thought, seen through her eyes. This wasn't imagination or dream. This was something else. Something impossible. The flashbacks came faster after that. At 11:02 p.m., I experienced her making dinner, stirring a pot of something over her camp stove, feeling the warmth of the fire. At 11:28 p.m., I felt her writing in her journal, the pen moving across paper, documenting the day's observations about canyon vegetation. At 11:51 p.m., I experienced her zipping into her sleeping bag, feeling tired and satisfied, looking forward to tomorrow's hike. All of it vivid and real and not mine. Then the timeline shifted. The flashbacks started showing her fear. At 12:17, I felt what she felt when she first noticed something was wrong. A sound outside her tent that didn't match any animal she knew. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across rock. I felt her heart rate increase, felt her reach for her flashlight with hands that were her hands, but that I was somehow experiencing. At 12:34 a.m., I felt her confusion when she opened her tent and saw nothing. But the scraping sound continued, circling her campsite, getting closer. At 12:58 a.m., I experienced her terror. Something was at her tent. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it breathing, the same breathing I'd heard earlier. She grabbed her satellite communicator with shaking hands and typed the message. "Something wrong. Need help." I felt her finger press the send button. I felt her decision to stay in her tent because going outside seemed more dangerous than staying inside. I felt her lying in her sleeping bag with her flashlight clutched in both hands, listening to something circling her tent. At 1:23 a.m., the flashback showed me the tent zipper opening. Not from inside, from outside. Someone or something was unzipping her tent from the exterior, slowly, deliberately. I felt her absolute panic, felt her scramble backward in her sleeping bag, felt her open her mouth to scream. And then the flashback cut off abruptly, and I was back in my own body, in my own tent, screaming myself, my throat raw from a sound I didn't remember starting. I grabbed everything I could carry, flashlight, water bottle, satellite communicator, and ran from that campsite in the darkness. Ran blindly down the trail toward Clear Creek, stumbling over rocks, not caring about twisted ankles or falls, just desperate to get away from that location. I made it maybe a quarter mile before I collapsed, gasping, and spent the rest of the night huddled against a boulder with my flashlight on, waiting for dawn. When sunrise came, I hiked back to the campsite. My tent was still there, zipped closed exactly as I'd left it when I first climbed inside. All my gear was undisturbed. Nothing had been moved or taken. But the experience of those hours remained vivid in my memory. Not my memory, Sarah's memory, transferred to me somehow through occupying the same physical space where she'd experienced her final hours. I packed up and hiked out that day, abandoning my permit and my planned route. At the ranger station, I filed a report describing what I'd experienced. The ranger listened politely and asked if I wanted medical evaluation. I declined. I wasn't injured or hallucinating. I'd experienced something real that couldn't be explained through normal frameworks. He made notes, thanked me for the report, and that was it. I've researched since then, looking for similar accounts, other stories of people experiencing location-based memories or psychic imprinting. I found a few references to the phenomenon in paranormal literature. The idea that traumatic events can somehow be recorded into physical locations and replayed under certain conditions. But nothing scientific. Nothing that would help me understand how I experienced hours of Sarah Crenshaw's final night in precise chronological detail. The worst part is that I don't know what happened to her after 1:23 a.m. The flashbacks cut off at that moment when her tent zipper opened from outside. Whatever happened next, whether she was taken, killed, disappeared into some other state of existence, I didn't experience. The location only held the trauma up to that point. Everything after remained unknown. I still hike, still love the wilderness. But I research campsite histories now before I go, looking for any mentions of disappearances or deaths or unexplained incidents. And I avoid camping at specific coordinates that appear in missing persons reports. Because some places hold on to what happened there with such intensity that being present forces you to become a temporary vessel for memories that aren't yours. And experiencing someone's terror so completely that you can't distinguish their fear from your own is something I never want to experience again. Sarah Crenshaw is still missing. Her case is still open. And somewhere in the Grand Canyon backcountry, campsite BE4 still holds the memory of her final conscious hours, waiting for the next person who camps there to relive what she experienced in those terrifying moments before she vanished forever. What would it mean to save someone's life if that person never existed? I've been a volunteer with Grand Canyon Search and Rescue for 7 years, responding to dozens of call-outs for lost hikers, injured climbers, and medical emergencies in the backcountry. I'm trained in wilderness medicine, technical rope rescue, and emergency response protocols. I understand how the system works. Someone goes missing, dispatch coordinates the search, we find them, we bring them out. Clear procedures, documented processes. But in November 2024, I participated in a rescue on the South Kaibab Trail that violated every principle of reality I thought I understood. Because the person we saved has no record of ever entering the park, doesn't appear in any photographs despite multiple witnesses seeing them, and may not actually exist in any way I can prove. The call came in around 2 p.m. on November 14th. A hiker in distress approximately 3 miles down South Kaibab Trail near Skeleton Point. The report came from multiple sources. 3 separate groups of hikers had reported seeing a young woman sitting on the trail, clearly in medical distress, unable to continue. She was described consistently across all reports. Early 20s, blonde hair in a ponytail, wearing a red jacket and black hiking pants, appearing severely dehydrated and disoriented. Standard heat exhaustion case, despite November's cooler temperatures. We get these calls regularly. People underestimate the canyon, run out of water, get into trouble. Our team assembled within 20 minutes. 6 of us, including me, carrying medical supplies, extra water, a litter in case she couldn't walk out. The descent down South Kaibab is straightforward. Well-maintained trail, good visibility, no technical sections. We made excellent time, reaching the reported location around 3:15 p.m. And there she was, exactly as described. Sitting on a rock about 20 feet off the trail, head down, clearly in distress. Red jacket, blonde ponytail. Young, maybe 23 or 24. Everything matched the reports. I approached first, introducing myself, asking her name and if she could tell me what was wrong. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed slightly unfocused and said, "Emma. My name is Emma Chen. I think I'm dehydrated. I ran out of water hours ago." Her voice was weak but coherent. I did a quick assessment. Elevated heart rate, dry mouth, confusion, classic signs of dehydration. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but she definitely needed intervention. We got her drinking water slowly, applied cool compresses, started monitoring her vitals. My teammate Rodriguez started asking standard questions for our incident report. Where had she started hiking today? The rim, she said. This morning around 8 a.m. Did she have a permit if she was planning to camp overnight? No permit, just a day hike. I thought I could make it down and back. What trailhead had she used? South Kaibab, she said, pointing up, toward the rim. Standard answers, nothing unusual. Except Rodriguez looked confused and pulled me aside. I radioed dispatch to pull her entry record, he whispered. There's no Emma Chen logged at any trailhead today. No entry pass, no permit, nothing. I frowned. Sometimes people skip the entry stations, don't fill out the voluntary registration forms. It's against park rules, but it happens. She probably just didn't register, I said. Rodriguez shook his head. I described her specifically. They checked the parking lot cameras at South Kaibab Trailhead. No one matching her description entered the trail today. No one at all. That was odd, but not impossible. Maybe she'd been dropped off by someone, walked to the trailhead from a different location, somehow avoided the cameras. I returned to Emma and continued the assessment. She was responding well to hydration, color returning to her face, becoming more alert. We decided she could walk out with assistance rather than requiring a litter carry. Standard protocol. We'd help her back to the rim, complete the paperwork, everything by the book. The hike back up took about 2 hours. Emma walked between 2 team members, moving slowly but steadily. We encountered several groups of hikers descending, and something strange happened each time. People would look directly at our group, smile and nod at the rescue team members, but their eyes seemed to slide past Emma without registering her presence, like she was invisible to them. One photographer was taking pictures of his group on the trail, and I watched him frame a shot that should have included Emma standing right behind his subjects. He took the photo, looked at his camera screen, and seemed satisfied. But Emma was directly in the frame. How could he not see her? I dismissed it as people being focused on their own experiences, not paying attention to others. But it kept happening. By the time we reached the rim around 5:30 p.m., I'd counted at least 15 people who'd looked directly at our group, but showed no reaction to Emma despite her being clearly visible in a bright red jacket. When we passed rangers on the trail, they acknowledged our team but didn't acknowledge her specifically, like she wasn't there. But she was there. I could see her, touch her shoulder to steady her on steep sections, hear her thanking us for the help. At the rim, we brought Emma to the ranger station for standard post-rescue documentation. That's when things became impossible to rationalize. The ranger at the desk, Martinez, someone I've worked with dozens of times, asked for Emma's identification to complete the incident report. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a driver's license. Colorado ID, Emma Chen. Birth date showing she was 24. Current address in Denver. Everything looked legitimate. Martinez examined it, started entering information into the computer, then stopped, stared at the screen, looked at Emma, looked back at the screen. This ID number doesn't exist in the system, Martinez said slowly. She ran it again. Same result. She tried the name and birth date combination. Nothing. According to our database, this identification number was never issued by Colorado DMV. Emma looked confused, insisted it was her real ID. She'd had it for years. Martinez excused herself and made a phone call. Came back 10 minutes later, looking unsettled. I called Colorado DMV directly. That ID number is not in their system. The address listed doesn't exist. And there's no record of anyone named Emma Chen with that birth date holding a Colorado driver's license. My team exchanged glances. This didn't make sense. Emma was sitting right in front of us, solid and real, drinking water from a bottle I'd handed her. How could she not exist in any official records? Rodriguez suggested maybe she had a fake ID for some reason. But that didn't explain everything else. Martinez pulled up the parking lot camera footage from South Kaibab Trailhead, showed us the recordings from early morning. We watched every single person who'd entered the trail between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. Emma wasn't in any of the footage. No one in a red jacket. No one matching her description at all. Maybe she used a different trailhead, I suggested, though I knew Emma had specifically said South Kaibab. Martinez checked Bright Angel, Grandview, every trailhead on the south rim. No red jacket, no blonde ponytail, no Emma Chen. It was like she'd appeared on that trail without ever entering it. Martinez then did something that made my blood run cold. She asked the hikers who'd reported the distressed woman to look at Emma and confirm she was the person they'd seen. We called in two of the reporting parties who were still at the rim. They looked right at Emma sitting in the ranger station and said they didn't see anyone matching that description. They described the woman they'd reported. Red jacket, blonde ponytail, early 20s, in distress at Skeleton Point. Exact description of Emma. But when asked to identify her, sitting right there in front of them, they said no. That wasn't the woman they'd seen. The woman they'd seen had looked different. They couldn't explain how, just different. Emma was becoming visibly upset now, insisting she was real. She existed. This was crazy. I believed her because I was looking right at her. But the evidence said otherwise. Martinez pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. In 7 years of working SAR coordination, I've had 3 cases like this. Someone gets rescued, brought to the station, but doesn't exist in any verifiable way. No records, no photographs. Witnesses can't identify them afterward despite matching descriptions. We document what we can and let them go because what else can we do? We can't hold someone for not existing. She went back to the computer and showed me the other incident reports. Same pattern. Detailed rescue documentation, physical descriptions, medical assessments. But no identification verification, no photographic evidence, and follow-up investigations finding no trace of the person's existence. We completed the incident report with the information we had, documented Emma's stated identity even though we couldn't verify it, and released her. She thanked us, said she'd be more careful next time, and walked toward the parking lot. I followed at a distance, watching. She walked between cars, looking for something, then seemed to fade slightly in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at her, she was still there, but less solid somehow. She turned a corner near the visitor center, and I rushed to follow. When I rounded the corner 3 seconds later, she was gone. Just gone. Empty walkway, no places to hide, no buildings she could have entered that quickly. Vanished. I went back to the ranger station and asked Martinez to show me the security footage from the station interior during our time with Emma. She pulled it up. The footage showed our rescue team entering, sitting in chairs arranged around Martinez's desk, talking to empty space. Emma wasn't in the footage, not one frame. But the water bottle I'd given her was visible, hanging in midair where her hand should have been holding it, moving as if someone was drinking from it. My hand appeared in frame, touching her shoulder to reassure her, but there was no shoulder visible, just my hand resting on empty air. I've watched that footage maybe 50 times. Our entire team is visible. The Rangers are visible. Emma Chen is not visible. But I can remember every detail of her face, hear her voice in my memory, recall the physical sensation of helping her climb back up the trail. 6 members of my team share those memories. We all saw her, spoke with her, touched her. But she doesn't exist in any recording or photograph. Multiple hikers reported seeing her and gave consistent descriptions, but none of them could identify her afterward. And all official records show that no one by that name entered the park that day. The psychological assessment the Park Service required me to undergo concluded that our team experienced a shared hallucination, possibly triggered by environmental factors or group psychology. But hallucinations don't show water bottles floating in security footage. They don't trigger emergency calls from multiple independent witnesses. Martinez told me unofficially that these cases are filed under a special category that doesn't appear in public incident reports. Anomalous rescues, she called them. Events where someone is clearly rescued but can't be proven to have existed. I still volunteer with SAR, still respond to calls, but I look at every person I rescue differently now, wondering if they're fully real or something else. something that exists in the moment, solid and present and desperately needing help, but unable to leave any permanent evidence of their existence. Emma Chen is out there somewhere, maybe hiking other trails, maybe appearing in distress and being rescued by other teams who'll discover what we discovered. That saving someone's life doesn't always mean that person existed in any way the world can measure or record. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. If someone can be real enough to rescue, but not real enough to prove existed, what does that say about the nature of reality itself and the spaces where the rules become negotiable? Would you keep working somewhere if the pictures on the wall started changing when you weren't looking? I'm a retired high school history teacher who took a part-time night janitor position at the Grand Canyon Visitor Center to supplement my pension and stay active after my wife passed. The work is simple, solitary, and keeps me occupied during the long winter nights when being alone in my house feels unbearable. But in January 2025, I started noticing changes in the historical photographs displayed throughout the museum section. Subtle alterations at first. New figures appearing in the backgrounds of century-old images, always closer to the camera than they'd been the previous night. And I've documented every change meticulously because my training as a historian demands evidence, even when that evidence suggests something impossible is approaching through time itself. I started working at the Visitor Center in November 2024. The night shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, and my responsibilities are straightforward. Clean the public areas, empty trash bins, mop floors, check that windows and doors are secured, monitor the building for any issues. The Visitor Center closes to the public at 5 p.m., so by the time I arrive, it's been empty for hours. Just me and the exhibits. Dioramas of canyon geology, Native American artifacts, and an extensive collection of historical photographs documenting the Grand Canyon's transformation from barely accessible wilderness to one of America's most visited national parks. The photograph collection is impressive. Images dating back to the 1880s, showing early explorers, the construction of the South Rim facilities, tourists in period clothing posing at overlooks, mining operations, railway construction. As a history teacher, I found myself studying these photos during my breaks, reading the descriptive plaques, mentally cataloging the progression of human interaction with the canyon. I'd spent 32 years teaching American history to teenagers. These photographs were primary sources, windows into the past, and I treated them with the respect they deserved. The first change I noticed was on January 7th. I was cleaning the exhibit hall around 2 a.m., had just finished mopping the floor in front of the photograph collection, when I stopped to look at an image I'd examined many times before. A 1902 photograph of tourists at the South Rim. 8 people in Victorian-era clothing posed at what's now Mather Point. I'd memorized this photograph. 4 men in suits and hats, 3 women in long dresses, 1 child. But as I looked at it that night, I counted 9 people. There was an additional figure in the background, partially obscured behind one of the women, someone I was certain hadn't been there before. I attributed it to tired eyes. I'd been working for 4 hours. It was the middle of the night. My memory wasn't infallible despite decades of training it to retain historical details. But the discrepancy bothered me enough that I took out my phone and photographed the image. When I got home that morning, I compared it to the official Grand Canyon Archive website, which hosts digital versions of many historical photos. The online version showed 8 people. My phone photo showed 9. I convinced myself the digital archive might be showing a cropped version, or I was misremembering the original. The next night, January 8th, I examined the photograph carefully before starting my cleaning routine. 9 people, including the partially obscured figure in the background. I made detailed notes: position, clothing, relative size. Then I cleaned the building and returned to check the photo at the end of my shift around 5 a.m. The figure had moved. It was no longer partially obscured. It now stood between two of the original subjects, clearly visible, wearing dark clothing that contrasted with the lighter Victorian attire of the others. And it was closer to the camera, as if it had stepped forward. My heart rate accelerated. Photographs don't change. They're fixed moments, frozen in time, unchangeable by definition. I took another phone photo and compared it side by side with the one from the previous night. The figure had definitely moved forward. I examined the frame itself, wondering if someone was playing a prank, swapping out images. But the frame was sealed with museum-grade security fasteners. The glass was dusty in the corners, undisturbed. No one had accessed this photograph except through looking at it. I reported it to my supervisor the next day. She listened politely and suggested the night shifts might be affecting my perception. When I showed her the phone photos, she pointed out they were taken under different lighting conditions, from slightly different angles, and that parallax effects could make subjects appear to shift position. She wasn't dismissive exactly, just rational in a way that made me feel foolish for bringing it up. I dropped the subject but continued monitoring. Over the following week, the figure continued moving forward in the photograph, each night measurably closer to the front of the group. By January 14th, it stood in the front row, as prominent as any of the original subjects. But here's what made my blood run cold. The figure's face was never quite in focus. Every other person in the photograph, even those farther from the camera, had clear facial features. This figure remained slightly blurred, as if caught in motion during a long exposure, except everyone else was perfectly still. Then I noticed other photographs were changing too. An 1895 image of miners at the Grandview mine showed an additional figure standing in the mine entrance. Someone who hadn't been there before. A 1908 photograph of the El Tovar Hotel under construction had a silhouette visible in a window of the unfinished building. Impossible because the building had no floors or interior walls at the time that photo was taken. A 1920 photograph of tourists boarding mules showed an extra person mounted on a mule at the end of the line, partially cut off by the frame edge. I documented everything. Photographs taken nightly, detailed written descriptions, comparative analysis with archival versions. My historian training provided a framework for empirical observation, even when the observations defied rational explanation. I created a spreadsheet tracking each altered photograph, noting the date I first observed changes, the nature of the alterations, and the progression of any moving figures. Within 2 weeks, I'd identified 17 photographs showing anomalies. The pattern became clear. The figures always moved forward, toward the camera, toward the present moment that separated the photographs from the viewer. They appeared first in backgrounds, barely visible, easily dismissed as artifacts or misperceptions. Then, progressively closer with each observation, becoming more prominent, more defined, except for their faces, which remained persistently blurred. And they appeared to move through the photographs chronologically. The figure that started in the 1902 image eventually reached the front and then disappeared from that photo entirely and appeared in a 1906 photograph, starting the progression again. The psychological toll was significant. I'm a rational person. I spent 3 decades teaching evidence-based historical analysis. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. But I couldn't deny what I was documenting. Either the photographs were genuinely changing, which violated everything I understood about physical reality, or I was experiencing a very specific, progressive hallucination that maintained internal consistency across weeks of observation. Neither possibility was comforting. On January 23rd, something changed. I arrived for my shift and immediately checked the photograph collection, as had become my nightly ritual. The figure from the 1902 image, which had disappeared from that photo 3 days earlier, had appeared in the most recent photograph in the collection. A 1965 image of the Visitor Center's original dedication ceremony. And it was at the very front of the image, standing closer to the camera than any of the original subjects, turned slightly as if looking back at them. For the first time, I could see partial facial features through the blur. Eyes, definitely eyes, looking toward the camera, toward me. I left the building, just walked out, abandoning my shift, something I'd never done in 5 months of employment. I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater on, trying to process what I'd seen. At some point, I fell asleep, and when I woke at dawn, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Stress, grief over my wife, isolation, all reasonable explanations for paranoia. I went back inside to finish my shift. The photograph showed only the original subjects from 1965. The additional figure was gone. Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. It had been a hallucination after all. Exhaustion, suggestion, the power of expectation creating false perceptions. I finished cleaning, filed an apologetic note about leaving early, and went home planning to take a few days off to rest. But when I developed the film from the security camera that monitors the exhibit hall, yes, I'd installed my own camera 2 weeks earlier to capture objective evidence. The figure was there, in every frame from that night. Standing at the front of the 1965 photograph, face partially visible, eyes directed at the camera. At my camera. Not the 1965 camera that took the original photograph, but the security camera I'd installed in 2025. I'm writing this from my house. I submitted my resignation yesterday, effective immediately. The Visitor Center accepted it without requiring an explanation, which makes me wonder if previous night janitors have resigned suddenly for similar reasons. I've sent my documentation, spreadsheets, photographs, video footage, detailed notes, to the park's historical archive with a request that someone investigate. I don't expect acknowledgement. The part that haunts me is the progression. Whatever those figures were, they moved forward through time via the photographs. From 1902 to 1906 to 1920 to 1965, always advancing, always getting closer to the present. The newest photograph in that collection is from 1965. But the Visitor Center has security cameras that record digital images every day. Current images, present moment images. And if those figures can move through photographs, getting closer to the viewer with each progression, what happens when they reach images from today? What happens when there's no more historical distance between the photograph and the person looking at it? I'm not going back to find out. But someone else will work that night shift. Someone else will clean that exhibit hall and study those photographs. And eventually, someone else will notice what I noticed and document what I documented. I hope they're more courageous than I am, or wiser. Wise enough to leave before the figures reach the final photograph and step through it entirely. If you found proof that your death was already written in history, would you try to change it? I'm a doctoral candidate at Northern Arizona University researching visitor patterns at Grand Canyon National Park for my dissertation in cultural anthropology. In April 2025, while examining archived visitor logs from the 1970s in the park's administrative building, I discovered entries written in my own handwriting, describing events that are happening to me right now, documenting my research process with impossible accuracy. and culminating in a final entry dated tomorrow that describes my death at Lipan Point with enough specific detail that I can't dismiss it as coincidence. And I'm writing this because I need someone to know what I found before I make the choice I'm terrified I've already made. My research focuses on how visitor behavior at national parks has evolved over 5 decades, using primary source materials like visitor logs, ranger reports, and administrative records. The Grand Canyon has maintained meticulous documentation since becoming a national park in 1919. And the archives contain thousands of handwritten entries from visitors, employees, and researchers. My dissertation advisor secured me access to restricted materials in the park's administrative archive, a climate-controlled facility in a back office of the Backcountry Information Center where documents too fragile or sensitive for public access are stored. I'd been working in the archives for 2 weeks, photographing pages from visitor logs, when I found the first entry. It was in a logbook from March 1974, documenting visitors who'd requested backcountry camping permits. Most entries were standard: name, date, destination, group size. But one entry, dated March 17, 1974, was written in handwriting I recognized immediately because I'd been staring at my own field notes for hours. My handwriting, unmistakable. The entry read, Dr. Sarah Vance, solo research trip, investigating archival documentation patterns, will discover temporal anomaly in 1974 records. My name is Sarah Vance. I'm not a doctor yet, still working on my dissertation, but Dr. Vance is what I'll be called when I finish. The entry was dated 51 years before I was born. The ink had faded the way 50-year-old ink fades. The paper showed age-appropriate deterioration. This wasn't a recent forgery, but it was absolutely my handwriting, and it described exactly what I was doing: investigating archival documentation. I photographed the page with trembling hands, told myself it was coincidence. Someone with similar handwriting, similar research interests, similar name. Except Sarah Vance isn't a common name, and the handwriting wasn't just similar. It was identical down to the way I formed certain letters, the specific slant of my cursive, the pressure patterns that are as unique as fingerprints. I continued through the 1974 logs, looking for more anomalies. Found another entry on April 3, 1974. S. Vance returned to archives, experiencing significant cognitive dissonance regarding temporal documentation. Questioned authenticity of March 17th entry. Will continue investigation despite psychological distress. That was exactly what I was experiencing at that moment. The entry described my thoughts with perfect accuracy, written decades before I was born. Over the next 3 days, I found 17 more entries spanning from 1974 to 1978. Scattered across different logbooks, different administrative documents, always in my handwriting. They documented my research process chronologically as I was living it. An entry from June 1975 described my meeting with my dissertation advisor last month. An entry from September 1976 mentioned the specific hotel in Tusayan where I'm staying. A December 1977 entry listed the exact documents I'd examined that day. The entries were predicting my actions, or documenting them retroactively, and this is what terrified me, proving that everything I was doing had already been done, already been recorded, already existed in a fixed timeline I was powerless to change. The psychological impact was devastating. Every action I took, I found documented in historical records from 50 years ago. When I decided to take a day off from research and hike to the rim, I found an entry from August 1976 describing that exact decision, including the trail I chose and the time I arrived at the overlook. When I called my advisor to discuss my findings, an entry from January 1977 recorded the conversation topics and his skeptical response. I was living inside a predestination loop where my future had already become the past. I started testing it, making random decisions, doing unpredictable things, trying to break the pattern. I'd flip a coin to determine which archive box to examine next, then check the corresponding 1970s documentation to see if my choice had been predicted. It always had been. The entries described my coin flips, my attempts to deviate from the documented timeline, my growing desperation to prove I had free will. A particularly devastating entry from May 1977 read, S. Vance experiencing existential crisis regarding determinism. Will attempt to leave Grand Canyon and abandon research. Will return within 48 hours because the work is too important to abandon. I did exactly that. Packed my bags, drove to Flagstaff, sat in a coffee shop for 2 days trying to convince myself to go home to Tucson and quit the program. But the dissertation was too important. The research too valuable. I drove back to Grand Canyon after 47 hours and 50 minutes. Not because the entry predicted I would, but because I independently decided to return. Except the entry proved that independent decision wasn't independent at all. It was predetermined, documented decades before I made it. Then I found the final entry. It was in a ranger incident report from April 20th, 1978. The entry was longer than the others, more detailed, and it described my death. Dr. Sarah Vance, researcher examining historical records, will visit Lipan Point tomorrow at 6:17 a.m. to observe sunrise. Will stand at the eastern edge of the overlook platform. At 6:29 a.m., while photographing the canyon in early light, will step backward to adjust camera angle and will lose footing on loose gravel at the platform edge. Will fall approximately 40 feet onto rock ledge below overlook. Impact will cause fatal head trauma. Body will be discovered by park visitors at approximately 7:45 a.m. The entry was dated April 19th, 1978. Tomorrow is April 20th, 2025. The entry described tomorrow morning with specific precision. Location, time, action, cause of death. And the worst part was recognizing the scenario as something I'd already planned. I'd marked tomorrow in my calendar weeks ago as the day to photograph sunrise from Lipan Point for the dissertation's visual documentation section. I'd chosen 6:15 a.m. arrival time to catch the best light. I'd planned to shoot from the eastern edge of the platform because that angle provides optimal composition. Every detail the entry described was something I'd independently decided before finding the entry. Which meant either I'd read the entry and unconsciously incorporated its details into my plans, or my plans had always been predetermined, and the entry was simply documenting what would inevitably happen. Either way, the result was the same. Tomorrow morning at 6:29 a.m., according to historical records from 1978, I would die at Lipan Point. I could choose not to go. That's what free will demands, the ability to deviate from prediction, to choose otherwise. But every other entry had been accurate. Every attempt I'd made to break the pattern had been predicted and documented. The entry about my departure and return to the canyon proved that even my rebellions were predetermined. And there was something else. A handwritten note at the bottom of the April 19th, 1978 entry, added in different ink as if written later. S. Vance will read this entry and will choose to visit Lipan Point despite the warning, because she must know if the timeline can be changed. The experiment requires completion. That's what this is. An experiment. Somehow, impossibly, my past self or my future self or some version of myself existing outside linear time has been documenting this entire process through historical records, creating a predestination paradox where the documentation itself becomes the cause of the events it describes. And the only way to resolve the paradox is to complete the loop. To do what the entries predict, to visit Lipan Point tomorrow morning, to either die as predicted or survive and prove the timeline mutable. I've spent the last 6 hours since finding the final entry researching predestination paradoxes, temporal loops, and the philosophical implications of determinism versus free will. I've documented everything, photographed every entry, written detailed notes, created a timeline comparing the historical entries to my actual actions. The correlation is perfect. Not a single deviation. Not one prediction that failed to manifest. Tomorrow morning, I'll drive to Lipan Point. I'll arrive at 6:15 a.m. I'll walk to the eastern edge of the overlook platform. At 6:29 a.m., I'll step backward while adjusting my camera angle. And in that moment, I'll discover whether the loose gravel the entry described is actually there, whether my foot will actually slip, whether history recorded in 1978 can dictate my death in 2025, or whether knowing the prediction gives me the power to change it, to step more carefully, to avoid the gravel, to survive and invalidate everything the entries have documented. The philosophical question is whether I'm choosing to go, or whether the entries documenting my choice have eliminated choice entirely. If I don't go, am I exercising free will or simply playing out a different predetermined timeline where I choose not to go, and that choice has its own consequences? The only way to know is to go. To stand at that exact spot at that exact time and see what happens. To complete the experiment that my temporally displaced self has been documenting for 50 years. I'm writing this and leaving it in my hotel room so that if the prediction is accurate and I die tomorrow morning, someone will understand what happened. The entries in the archives prove that someone outside normal time has been documenting my life. Maybe that someone is me, existing in a state where past and future are accessible simultaneously. Maybe I survive tomorrow and spend the next 50 years going back through archives, inserting the entries that led me to this moment, closing the loop. Or maybe I die tomorrow and the entries remain an unexplained mystery, documentation without an author, a warning from a timeline that never fully resolves. Either way, tomorrow morning at Lipan Point, I'll have my answer. And if you're reading this, you'll know whether the answer was survival or exactly what the entry from April 20th, 1978 predicted. If stories like this fascinate and terrify you, if you want to explore more disturbing tales that blur the line between the possible and the impossible, visit VerifiedFears on YouTube. Because the scariest stories are the ones that make you question whether reality follows the rules we think it does, or whether some events are written in history long before they happen, waiting for us to live them exactly as they were documented decades ago.